Hello, I'm Rebecca Kimbel. With all the news on polygamy as of late, with the movie The Outlaw Prophet, with Warren Jeffs being shown on Dateline and Unbreakable with Rebecca Musser, with Anderson Cooper and Mike Watkiss bringing shows on television lately, I thought it would be a very good idea for you to hear a discussion about the inside culture of polygamy. This will be a 4-part series. Our guest is Victoria Reynolds. Victoria and I have a lot in common. We were both raised in the AUB, the Apostolic United Brethren, which is the same polygamist group that Cody Brown and Sister Wives belong to. I was married into the FLDS. You all have heard of Warren Jeffs in the news and his numerous child brides. Warren Jeffs' father, Rulon Jeffs, performed my marriage when I was a child bride. If you saw the movie Outlaw Prophet, it was very, very close to being extremely authentic. I say close because the movie was kind compared to how we grew up. I am related to many famous polygamists. Tom Green, a former TV polygamist with 5 child brides, had 3 of them that were his stepdaughters. The youngest was my niece, Linda Coons. Rolling Stones magazine referred to the Kingston clan as America's most twisted crime family. I have nieces that are married into the Kingston clan. The most notorious polygamist of all is Ervil LeBaron. He was known as the Mormon Manson. He had approximately 30 people murdered. Ervil LeBaron's brother, Verlin, was married to 2 of my sisters and 1 of my cousins. Yes, the mass murderer was my brother-in-law's brother. One of those murdered was my Uncle Rulon, who was the head of the Apostolic United Brethren and the prophet before his brother Owen Allred took his place. Of course, Owen Allred is also my uncle. With all of the news on polygamy lately, I'm very, very grateful. This gives Victoria and I an opportunity to have a discussion, to educate you about the inside of the culture, why people stay, and why they do just what they do. So from 2 women who were fortunate enough to escape polygamy, please join us in this educational conversation. And I want to thank all the big media shows, because when we first spoke out, no one cared to listen. They thought it was just too bizarre to be true. Please welcome my guest, Victoria Reynolds. Let us continue to talk about the economic structure of polygamy, the money trail. The money trail, from the child brides to the lost boys, to the homes, to the welfare. Let's explain how that works, Victoria.
Okay. So this whole idea of a money trail was something that's fairly new to me, quite honestly. I had no idea, growing up as a child, I even though there was a part of me that questioned what I was being taught, there's also this blind obedience, because if you don't believe, then you'll pay for it for eternity. I was one of those kids that was always torn up inside, because what my inner truth was telling me was completely the opposite of what I was being taught religiously. And and then there was a part of me that thought that voice inside of me that was my inner voice of truth was actually a temptation of the devil. So I was terrified of my own truth.
Right.
And I revered the prophet. I thought he was an angel. And to me, when he came to visit us, he had this beautiful soft voice and this beautiful white hair. And to me, he was practically, as close to God as you can get, not understanding that prophet means prophet. I didn't know any of that, obviously, until a couple of years ago when I started writing my story. I'm writing another book called Fly, Fly Away, and I started writing my story and doing some research about the community and where it came from, and I started being just dumbfounded by what was really behind this beautiful facade of brotherly love.
Right.
And it's all ultimately about money and control.
Yes, it is. And I validate that because that prophet was my uncle.
Right. And you got to see who he really was. So for the rest of us who were just at the bottom of the totem pole, he was perfect.
Exactly. And who he really was in my life was inconsistent and a man that didn't keep his word. And when I asked my mom about it, she slapped me. And I knew in the moment that she hit me that I had crossed a bridge. She was afraid. Afraid. Her terror with that question was palpable. I felt her terror more than I felt that hard slap. She was terrified that I would question. And she said, "Would you question the word of the Lord?" And she was trembling. She was scared to death.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so I didn't ask anymore. I just watched.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you got to see that from inside the family. And I didn't see any of that. All I saw, well, at least with him, and after he was murdered by the LeBarons, again, we come back to this whole murder. Rival cult leaders.
Blood atonement.
They don't seem to think twice about killing each other.
Right.
After he died, I was about 12 years old, and then my eyes really started to get open, and I did not had no even attraction of any kind whatsoever with his replacement,
Right.
who was his brother. Never felt anything about that man that felt comfortable or like a prophet or like a man of God, and certainly not the men that ran the community. The men who run the community, I could feel, I felt like when I was a little girl, they felt like bad men to me.
Right.
And I think small children get that. And yet you weren't allowed to question these men who were in charge because they were my leaders. But deep inside, I thought, these are not good people. I don't trust these people. I don't think I ever went into any of those men's homes because I was so afraid of them.
But they also would fondle you and whatnot when they were adult men. They'd fondle the little girls when they were alone, right? And
yeah, and I never knew that. That was part of what I started to uncover when I was writing my book. I thought, oh my gosh. I thought I was the only little girl who was molested.
Right.
And then as I started uncovering the truth, I was just, it literally was really hard for me at first because it shattered all of my beliefs. Even though I had left years ago, there was still a part of me that said, they're not bad people. They're just doing, that's their path and it's not mine. And it shattered all of my childhood beliefs. It's like when a kid first finds out Santa Claus isn't real. When I first found out that the prophet isn't who I thought he was, and that what I thought was God's truth isn't really what it was, it shattered me, even though I was a grown woman and just doing research. It wasn't that a part of me still believed it was true. It was just a part of my heart sunk thinking that I was raised in that and that none of it was true.
Right.
And there was still a part of me that wanted to believe that at least the people were good.
Well, it's hard to believe that a person that you thought was a good man could actually be so evil.
Yeah.
That's the pain of it, to realize that the women and the children and the people's property dedicated to the church and the welfare money they received and wouldn't let the women have it because Owen himself, Ruin's replacement, said women are not allowed to handle money in a celestial marriage.
Right.
So they didn't get to keep their welfare even. Everybody was dirt poor except the leaders. And what about the boys, the lost boys?
Mm-hmm.
Tell the public about what lost boys means. What happens to them?
Well, what happens, they're really ostracized. See, the younger boys are considered competition for girls. The girls are a means of property. They're used for exchange. They get passed around like, I'm done with this toy now, it's your turn. It's written into the culture that women can just be traded. And what's natural in human beings is that when girls and boys get to be teenagers, we find each other attractive.
Right.
That's just how that's just how the human animal is made.
How sinful.
And so, suddenly there's this girl that's coming of age, and you have an old man up here that doesn't have his 3 wives. And there's a young guy here who hasn't proven himself worthy yet. He's going to get kicked out because the old man doesn't have his 3 wives yet.
That's right.
So those boys are labeled as being sinful and unworthy, and they're thrown out. They're just thrown out. They could be 12, 13, 14 years old, and they are just thrown out like trash and called sons of perdition, because if you do anything that proves you are unworthy or that's sinful that you need to repent of, and you're told you're going to go to hell, you become what's called a son of perdition. So these are poor, these they're still babies. And I look at a 14-year-old boy, and they're still babies. They still need their mommies.
Some of the accusations made to kick them out were totally untrue. Mm-hmm. Just being accused was enough, like a witch hunt.
Just being accused was enough. Yeah, there were some kids in my community. I mean, when I watched my oldest brother go through this, he was basically, kicked out. They threw kids in this, just being accused of being a bad influence. They would throw boys in this root cellar, was an underground prison, basically with a gate on it, and that's where they put these kids. And they all ended up just leaving. There were, 16, 17-year-old kids who basically became homeless. They would get in a car and go to Salt Lake City, or they would end up in, one of the nearby towns, but they were teenagers and homeless and figuring out how to fend for themselves.
My dad beat my brother Roger with a 2x4 and would have killed him if Lou Kelch hadn't said, stop, you're going to kill that boy, and ran him off when he was 13 in Salt Lake City.
Yeah.
We were there. And he, in the winter in Salt Lake City, slept up on top of the Woolworth building where the heat ducts were to keep from freezing to death. And in the summer, he slept in the bushes behind the school. And he had some friends that would occasionally bring him food or take him home to visit their mom. And he stole money from gum machines and whatnot to survive. 13 years old.
Yeah.
Firstborn son to a wife that wasn't a favorite wife, my mother. And his dominant wife didn't want him around.
Right.
And neither did Dad.
But he was probably a little strong-willed. Yeah, I think the only boys that stay are the ones who keep their mouths shut and do everything they're told.
Yeah. But then they still have to not have too many boys because there's competition for the girls.
Right. That's why I said the only boys that stick around are the ones that, that shut their mouth and do as they're told and then prove their worthiness.
Roger was a scapegoat from the beginning because Dad's favorite wife wanted to have the first boy and name that after Dad.
Right.
And Mom had the first boy, and that was unforgivable. And so he was a scapegoat. The women punish the children of the other wife they don't like. Mm-hmm. He was beat, It's really a wonder that he grew up as normal as he did. Of course, he never got into polygamy. He had a real life. He got into the Army and found out that his birth certificate was a forgery and Dad wasn't his dad. And he said, well, if that's not really my dad, if he didn't claim me, I don't have to be his son. I can be free. And so from that day on, he took his freedom.
He can be anybody he wants to be.
I can be who I want to be. But see, he was a lost boy before they cloaked that term.
Oh, yeah. It's before they had, I mean, the term lost boy is a fairly recent term.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The sons of the favorite wives are the ones that stay in.
Mm-hmm. Oh, you definitely have to have the right last name also. If you were a kid who didn't have the right last name, then you're out. Yeah.
Yes. And the pecking order is ridiculous. There is really a low class. There's least favorite wives, there's favorite wives and least favorite wives. And that doesn't have anything to do with first wife. My dad despised his first wife because she was educated, and he hated educated women.
Well, but now when that was that an arranged marriage with his first wife?
His first wife, he went on a mission for the Mormon Church, and he wasn't in polygamy. And he married his first wife, converted to polygamy, and because she was a teacher, he decided that he hated educated women. And he just, basically, she was just... The number doesn't matter. This is what people don't understand about polygamy.
Because where I grew up, and I have heard that before, when I read Carolyn Jessup's book about how the first wife was irrelevant, how it was just the woman that managed to, I personally think it's the woman that gave him the best sex, but
yeah, whatever. His favorite wife doesn't have anything to do with which number she is.
Yeah. So the way I felt growing up, and just watching, and maybe it's because I grew up in an environment where most of the members of the community were converts. The people who oversaw the community had been in polygamy for generations.
Right.
They had earned the right to be the royalty of the community. And almost everyone else was a convert, like my parents.
Right.
So what I saw was that the first wife was the queen bee, and all of the subsequent wives were their maidservants. Because a man came into the community and brought his first wife with him, and he loved his first wife. This was the case. I saw that with so many families where they fell in love with their first wife. The rest of the wives were just consorts.
And lived in poverty while the first wife lived well.
Right. And I can also see how if there were relationship issues with the first wife, one of the other women could rise to the alpha position.
Well, one of the Kingston girls was on TV 20 in Salt Lake City not long ago, and she said her father had about 200 kids, and his favorite wife changed all the time. It was usually the new young child bride. Mm-hmm. And then after the bloom was off the rose, then another one would be the favorite wife.
Right.
But it was always obvious who the favorite wife was. With my father, his favorite wife was actually another man's wife that already had a little girl. My father took her to wife as a plural wife, because he wanted her. Mm-hmm. She became the favorite wife. And everybody else fell secondary. When I studied polygamy, I found out more often than not that it didn't matter what number of wife you were. You were still a slave. Mm-hmm. It's just that some slaves lived better than others.
Right.
They could get priority. So the subculture among the wives was always competitive. It was always painful. On the surface, you love each other and present that to the world because you're going to go to hell. Mm-hmm. On the inside, you beat your sister wives' child with a coat hanger to get even with her. Mm. Because your husband spent the night with her last night.
Right.
And the child takes the blunt. And over and over and over, I've talked to children that were beaten by a sister wife, another mother.
Right.
Because the pecking order made them low enough that they were subject to the violence. And the violence is there.
Right. Well, and it's justified because that's how you raise your kids.
Right.
In the belief that a child needs to be brought to salvation by whatever means necessary, so hitting and beating a child into submission was perfectly acceptable behavior.
And violent beatings were perfectly acceptable.
Right.
But look at the men down in Colorado City that would beat their child brides if they were not compliable and lock them in a shed. Mm-hmm. And look how many of them were taken to the insane asylum and said that they were mentally ill because the church basically owned their state-funded insane asylum. If it was real, who knows? But they were still, the cops, everybody was in on it. Mm-hmm. You try to run away, the cops bring you back because they're FLDS, the God Squad.
Right.
In the United States of America, slavery. What are we doing looking across the pond and pointing fingers when we will not face our own problems?
Well, part of the issue that I see, and it's not just the polygamy, it's what I see in human rights abuses as a whole, is that in this country, presently, religious freedom supersedes human rights.
That's wrong. How can a belief system justify taking the rights of another human being?
Well, because as you said before, ultimately the belief is that God's laws supersede man's laws, not understanding that human rights are our God-given birthright. And human rights must take precedence because it is our birthright.
The religious concept that makes a leader wealthy and the followers paupers and own nothing is not religion, it's a business.
Well, religion is business, let's be honest. You know, they're both organizations that exist to perpetuate the organization. It is a business. And I think a lot of people are waking up and seeing that that's what it is. Once it becomes organized thought with a man at the top, very rarely is it a woman, interestingly enough, then it becomes an organization that becomes self-perpetuating. And often, sadly, it forgets why it was ever created to begin with. So a lot of times we have these belief systems that start out with perfectly good intentions, and then the organism itself becomes the perpetuation. And it forgets entirely why it was created.
That usually takes a generation?
I don't think it's an exact science, but you do start to see the evolution of belief and start to see how it accumulates into preserving the organization itself and not the people that are a part of it. It may have been started with perfectly good intentions to bring love and peace, and yet it becomes a space of control and terrorism.
It seems to be too tempting for the opportunity to take advantage that some people, if they get power, they just cannot resist taking advantage, because being the head of a religion is definitely a position of trust. Deep public trust. And yet we look at the problems that happened with child molesting the priests in the Catholic Church. We can point a finger at that and scream forever. But we don't want to look at the fact that that particular problem is prevalent across the nation in clergy of every denomination.
Every denomination, yeah.
98% of sexual violation trust of married women was done by clergy, because the women went to the clergy, and this is on the web, the women went to the clergy with their marital problems. Then, of course, that woman could never tell. She never had her husband as an ally because she went to the clergy.
Right.
And then when she found herself molested and raped by the clergy, she couldn't tell anybody.
Right.
You know, you look up, this is a statistical fact. And we point our fingers at a particular church when we don't realize that positions of trust, politically or religiously, that have no check and balance, it takes a person of honest character, really honest character, to hold those positions.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that once you end up in it starts out as a leadership position, and there's a vast difference between leadership and control, leadership and power. Huge difference between leadership and power. So when you start out in a position of leadership, the word leadership itself begins with the word leader.
Right.
The intent is to lead, and leading and guiding is love-based. Well, what happens is that when you end up in that position of leadership and you have all these people trusting you and looking up to you, unless you're really, really vigilant and really careful, it's so easy for the ego to get in there and flip it from leadership into power and control. And when you're given that much power and that much control over a group of people, you start to lose your vision. You become mad with power. You lose perspective of the reason you were given that leadership role to begin with.
At least that happens with the greater number. Yes, it does.
Yeah, and it can happen. So in a sense, a small community church is a much better place to be, because your odds are much better that it's a man and a wife who really want to help the community. And even in there, we find issues of children being molested and women being coerced away from their husbands. And a woman goes to the priest or the minister broken, and finds solace in the arms of the minister. And
willingly or not, some of it is not willingly.
And some of it's not willingly. But what happens is that, especially women, we are very emotional creatures.
Right.
And anyone who knows anything about the psychology of women, and I mean, what happens with women is that once we open up our heart to someone and share our pain story, we connect, we bond with that person.
Right.
And so it's very easy for women to fall in love with their minister because they've opened up their heart and shared their pain story with him.
Or their counselor, or any.
Or their counselor. You see women that fall in love with their therapists all the time.
All the time. Yeah.
And then what happens is that in that position of trust and love, it's then that leader's responsibility to control himself and say, I understand that you have these feelings for me. I can't go there with you.
Right.
And how many people in that position go, well,
yeah, exactly.
If I don't get caught.
Exactly.
Just don't tell anybody.
Because there's no check and balance for them.
Right.
They're working in an organization where they are the check and balance, and there's no check and balance.
And some people enter these organizations or these belief systems or these roles, these leadership roles, because they genuinely love and care about people. Somewhere in that process, they lose themselves.
Right.
And then there are some people who intentionally get into those roles because that's the kind of person that they are, and this is a place where they can
do it.
Easily do it and get away with it.
In the name of religion, great crimes are committed. So I can't even comprehend why religion should have precedence over human rights. A human right and freedom of choice is never freedom if it takes freedom away from somebody else to do it.
Correct. So there's a complete misperception around this, and Thomas Jefferson made it very clear that we are allowed to believe as we choose, not practice as we choose. He made that very distinct, that if a man practices as he chooses, every manner of abuse can be justified by religion. He was very specific. That doesn't say freedom of religion is freedom to act as you choose, it's freedom to believe as you choose. We're
true.
All entitled to our own beliefs.
And
belief is free.
And you're all entitled to believe in Santa Claus. It's when you bring him home to live that the problem starts.
Yeah. And that's really what it is that it's understanding the difference between belief and practice are two very different things.
Right.
And when your practice is out of alignment with what you know is morally true, which is always human rights,